Great to talk to you as always. Emmanuel Chaz in Kyiv. Let's move to here in Paris. Let's bring in Samantha de Bendern, political risk analyst, associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House, also senior consultant for EU-Russia relations at the Conflict Studies Research Centre, and previously worked as an advisor in the EU Commission on NATO-Ukraine relations and as advisor to the first EU ambassador to Russia. Great to have you on the programme with us tonight, Samantha. Just getting news coming in. This is from Reuters news agency saying Russia has destroyed the power line that connects the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant to the power grid. That's coming from Ukraine's energy minister. So we're already getting a sense, Samantha, of the cost of the overnight attacks.
Yes, well, that's the first I've heard about the Zaporizhia attacks. The good news is that Zaporizhia does have generators because it's very important for power stations to for nuclear power stations to have a constant feed of electricity to keep them, to be able to cool the reactor down. So let's hope that that's going to be looked into quite fast. Yes, this is Vladimir Putin. Every time Trump has spoken to him, in fact, there have been increased attacks on the civilian population. The fact that Kiev was so badly hit is a direct result of the lack of Patriot anti-missile defense systems, which the US have now said they are going to stop delivering to Ukraine. So things are looking pretty dire for Ukraine right now. And this is all because of Donald Trump's decisions.
Yeah, to which I wonder what you make of the readout. I guess more will come from this, but the readout we've had so far from Kyiv, which seems to try not to downplay the conversation, say that they are going to work, quote, together to help defend the skies. But there's no explicit answer, is there, over the Patriot missiles, to which the request has not been granted, and the idea that these weapons, some of which are being suspended, the defensive weapons, that's going to change.
Well, Kyiv has no choice. It cannot criticize the Americans. It cannot criticize Donald Trump. I had some very high-level meetings with Kyiv officials 2 weeks ago, and they were very clear that their main partner they see for discussions for defending their country are the Americans. They unfortunately, at this point, have very little faith in the Europeans. So they will continue trying to sweeten Trump, to sweeten the Americans as much as they can for as long as they can, because they absolutely need American cooperation. That is at least their view. What the Ukrainians do not want to end up with is a situation where they have to have bilateral talks between Ukraine and Russia without any mediators. Unfortunately, President Putin has made it very clear that at this point he wants to see bilateral discussions without anyone in between to mediate.
When you're listening to the conversation a moment ago that President Trump was having with reporters on the doorstep moment there, talking about the disappointment he had in Vladimir Putin, I don't remember seeing, I do after criticism after bombings before, but such disappointment after a phone call. If we go back a few weeks about, I'm waiting to see if he's tapping us along, this seemed far more explicit, didn't he? I wonder whether you think that's kind of taking Trump in a different direction, or he's simply too unpredictable to call.
You know, that there's an expression that works in Ukraine and in Russia, which is hope dies last. One can only hope that President Trump will change direction. So far, President Zelenskyy has done absolutely everything that Trump wanted. He signed a mineral deal. He actually offered to buy defense systems. He thanked President Trump. He has bent over backwards to actually please Trump after the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office in February. He has done everything that was asked for him, and the result has been to stop sending weapons. So I don't know what more the Ukrainians can actually do, except maybe just continue flattering Trump and hope that at some point it will work. If you remember that there was the NATO summit 10 days ago, during which a Ukrainian journalist asked President Trump if he was going to halt Patriot deliveries to Ukraine. Trump seemed slightly moved. He said, well, we need them as well. We're going to have to think about it. And the result has been that weapons that were earmarked by the previous administration and had been approved by Congress were actually halted in Poland and are not going to go forward to Ukraine. And by the way, Congress is now looking into the legality of that move. Unfortunately, Trump and it was the Deputy Secretary of Defense said the magic word was that these weapons were necessary for national security, i.e. American national security. And that is the only time in which weapons that were already earmarked could potentially be repatriated to the US. So Trump seems to know exactly what he's doing.
And we had also, taking us into Europe, this first call in 3 years with President Macron and President Putin talking for 2 hours earlier this week. Give me your reading on that, Samantha, because to understand why they decided to suddenly return to those talks, is this about Emmanuel Macron being aware of the uncertainty increasing over the US and making sure there's a voice for Europe still on the line there?
I think that, that a lot of people...
probably a sort of resentment vis-à-vis the recent decades and the Western.
We're going to go back to Emmanuel Macron. He jumped the gun there, Samantha. But give me your thoughts on why you think they decided he decided to reinitiate the conversation.
Well, I think President Macron doesn't seem to learn the lessons. The lessons are that there's absolutely no point in talking to Putin. He's just going to dish out the same things that he's dished out before. Perhaps the takeaway from this call is that Putin's position has hardened compared to the position that he had 3 years ago. Maybe that was the one good readout that Macron could take from this call, but it has not made Europe look any stronger. It has not made Europe look as though it is capable of taking the lead in filling in the gaps that the Americans are going to leave. If this call had been accompanied by some firm decisions, more than just going to Kiev and taking selfies, which is what European leaders have been doing, actually deciding to do something concrete that goes beyond words. Planes in the sky, there's an initiative called Sky Shield, which 23 European countries have been discussing, which would be to help protect Ukraine's skies. Taurus missiles to be released, the German Taurus missiles to be released, some kind of real impactful decision followed by a phone call or proceeding or for that to happen after the phone call, why not? But to talk, just to hear what Putin has to say, to be told, basically, we're going to do what we want to Ukraine, I don't think that makes President Macron look very strong, and it does not get a very good impression of Europe. Europe is, unfortunately, looking more and more like a talking shop that has the capacity to act, but is paralyzed by its fear of Putin. The NATO summit looked more like an event in which allies were more afraid of Trump than they were of the Russian threat. This is what we look like now.
That is a very interesting point. And to which, just going back to the Macron comment as well, the Macron conversation, I'm reminded of the fact that go back to 2022, the last phone calls he was having, there was a voices from the past, Mateusz Morawiecki, the former Polish president, saying that if you're going to negotiate with Putin, he likened it to negotiating with Hitler. He saw it as an extremely bad idea. But let's have a listen back. We can now hear President Macron. This was 10 months into the Ukraine war in 2022. And he was asked what it was like to deal with Putin when famously George Bush in 2001 said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. President Macron was asked what he sees looking in Putin's eyes.
I have to say a lot of probably a sort of resentment vis-à-vis the recent decades and the Western world. And a resentment vis-à-vis us, meaning both the US and the European Union, was extremely important. And the feeling that our perspective was to destroy Russia. I don't believe this is our perspective. It's never been our perspective in France.
I just wonder how, Samantha, that lines, I don't know if you've met Putin personally or those you've advised in the past in dealing with Putin, that reflects what President Macron had said back in 2022.
Actually, I'm just a humble Brit living in France. Who am I to disagree with President Macron? But I will dip my toes into the water and actually disagree with him. I think that President Putin, when he looks at European leaders, he feels a mixture of arrogance and disdain and mockery, because he sees how sort of impotent we are. And I'll include the Brits in that, and the Europeans in general. He does not, for him, the only interlocutor who he has any respect for are the Americans, whoever the president is. He knows that, unfortunately, at the moment, the only power that counts are the Americans. The Europeans could count. We have a larger population than the Americans. We have the money. We just need to be united. If we were really, truly united, politically as well as economically, we could stand our ground and we could defend ourselves. I understand why the Americans are fed up with defending Europe. I think it's dreadful that they're leaving Europe without really giving us a lot of warning, although some would argue we've had a lot of forewarning. But I don't think Putin believes in 1 minute that Europe poses any single threat to Russia. I think he believes that NATO, the combined strength of NATO, potentially poses a threat. I think he's convinced himself of that, in spite of the fact that everything that NATO has done has been as a defensive alliance. And you know, if NATO has enlarged, it's because the countries on Russia's borders feel threatened. But I think that when Putin speaks to individual European leaders, I think he's just disdainful.
Is there one upside, Samantha, which is in the last 2 weeks, the bombing in Iran? From a Ukrainian perspective, does that mean potentially less Shahid drones, less support for Russia on the battlefield?
Well, there has been a lot of speculation that it would need less Shahid drones. Russia is, however, producing its own Russian version of Shahid drones in Tatarstan, which is southern Russia. Interestingly enough, on the day that the Israelis started their bombing campaign into Iran, the Ukrainians launched a raid on one of the drone factories in Tatarstan. It could slightly slow down Russia's ability to buy Iranian drones, but unfortunately, Russia is producing its own. It has its whole economy on a quasi-war footing. Putin has said he's going to reduce defense spending, but if you look at what is earmarked in the budget, there is no reduction in defense spending. And that sounds more like a message to try and soften the Europeans than the reality of what is seen in Russia. For him to reduce defense spending, he would actually have to modify the existing budget.
Hence the message from Mark Rutte going back to the NATO meeting of over the next 5 years, either increase your spending or if not, prepare to speak Russian, he said. Great to have you on the programme, Samantha. Nice to talk to you this evening. Samantha de Bendern, political risk analyst and associate fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House.